Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the War of the Rebellion podcast for H Soul War. And today we are going into the muggy, buggy south of Alabama, or as he has it very prominently displayed on his website, West Florida formerly. And today I'm going to talk with Mike Bunn from historic Blakely State Park, which includes Spanish Fort, which some of my Civil War listeners are probably going to be aware of. And we just give you a little word on Mike. He has a bachelor's from Faulkner University and then a master's in history and his higher education administration from the University of Alabama, which my advisor once called Sabin University, of all things. He also got a graduate certificate in public history from the University of West Georgia. And today we are going to talk about a place and book that I always find very interesting because having lived in the Southeast for a number of years, obviously nowadays I'm living in Europe, uh, Mobile. I always like Mobile. Beautiful city, great seafood, great culture, kind of a miniature New Orleans in many regards. Very, very pretty place. And Mike wrote a book called This Southern Metropolis, Life in Antebellum Mobile, published by the University of Georgia Press under the New South Books imprint, actually. So, first, then, Mike, thank you so much for taking a little time out of your day today to join me on this podcast and tell us about you have written quite a few books. How did you come to decide that Mobile needed a little biography of its antebellum times?
Well, thank you for having me. Appreciate the interest. Obviously, anybody who spends as much time as a writer does researching and writing is very appreciative to have people interested in what they've done. So, thank you for that. So, how did I come to decide that Mobile needed something like this? Well, let me just say, Mobile is blessed to have a pretty good historiography. It's not a city that is devoid of good histories, and several are coming out in the near future on various aspects of it that I know about as well. But what really drove me to do this particular work was the fact that its antebellum history, in many ways, still looms excessively large in the city's past. It's really a defining era that we still recognize as a landmark, as sort of a hallmark of what the community is still. It is still in some ways defined by the antebellum existence. And I just didn't feel that what we had with just the basic facts, figures, a few photos of some antebellum mansions and all really gave the texture to it that I thought it could. As someone who's researched a lot of the time period and was increasingly familiar with all the people who had visited and what they were taking away from it. I just came away as I kept finding these quotes and these travel journals. I said, "There's a story there of Mobile as it was defined by people who visited rather than people who lived there that I think is worth telling, and maybe it would help illuminate a little bit what life was really like. Because as we all know, what you think of your home and the way you would describe it may be slightly different than someone who visited. So I just thought that was an interesting angle, and I wanted to give those people a voice.
No, yeah. And I thought that was a really interesting approach that you took with regard to kind of the way you decided to tell the story of Mobile. It wasn't you didn't look at local voices. You let the outsiders tell the story of Mobile. Why was that? Why did you decide to go that route?
Well, there are two primary reasons. One sort of practical, and one just sort of philosophical. One is that those people who are visiting they obviously are bringing a different perspective. They're not there every day. They're not there throughout the year. Uh, they may only see a certain aspect of the town, maybe at its best, maybe at its worst, but it's that snapshot that is a different perspective. That's one reason. The other reason is a little bit more practical, I would say, is that a lot of the people whose accounts that I rely on, not all, but a lot, were written with an idea that they would find an audience, a public audience. So these a lot of the core part of the visitor accounts are derived from travel journals that were meant to be publicly read, that were included in publications. Some went through many reprintings. That's a whole genre of writing at the time that was extraordinarily popular. It gave people an opportunity to visit and learn about places they would otherwise not be able to do. And when you consider that, it's not just the fact that they're describing it that's important. You've got to consider that if they're writing about a place and they're visiting a series of places within a short amount of time, they're purposely going to go either way to find something that's unique that really stands out about a place. It's easy enough to say they visited Montgomery. It's a nice city. Here's the size. I stayed in a good hotel. If they did that at every place they visited, that's pretty dull reading. But if you are really looking for something that really stands out, a really unique take on a place, that's more enlightening. It's more enlightening for the people reading it at the time. It's more enlightening for us today to see what were the things that stood out as most indicative of or symbolic of life in the community. And I thought that was a really compelling way to understand what they were doing, and that they were already doing it gave me access to good material. And like I said, and the other reason is, of course, just that they're inherently bringing a new perspective, regardless of what their audience eventually would be.
So that it sounds like a lot of the materials then was published materials that you were looking at.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. 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 Almost all of it. Um, there's something to be said about just private correspondence.
Mhm.
May even lend a different uh, uh, you know cast on some of these opinions. But if you're writing it for an audience and you're wanting them to read and you're wanting to provide an insightful opinion, remember this travel writing. This is not the same sort of travel writing we might think of today as a vacation guide. This is not just a listing of stuff. This is literature that
Mhm.
you want to have a unique take, and it's got to hold up to the truth. So you don't want to misrepresent things, but the readers depending on you to find really the heart of what is it that makes this community tick,
Mhm.
and your expression of that. And so if you have that, that's going to be a little bit different than some casual observations. And that doesn't mean that they're not going to be truthful or they're going to cover up some of the nasty stuff. They're going to tell you the good, bad, and the ugly. And sometimes that is, you know, honestly, was more intriguing to find the ugly and the bad in some of these travel writings. So I just felt you were going to get a really refined, fully thought out description through that means that would be different than in any other avenue of writing. And I thought that if you put all those together, it may not be the complete story. There's no way to say it's the complete story, but it is a version of the reality that I thought was worth considering.
No, I mean it was brilliantly kind of strung together in sort of the way you kind of approached the topics of what you experience in Mobile and everything. Were there any moments sort of like where you kind of were like I remember when I wrote my book on Macon, and I kind of tried on like reading these accounts of the soldiers approaching and people traveling into the region, and you kind of look at the map and you're kind of like, where is that? Were there any moments where you kind of had where you kind of read an account and you were like, I have no idea where I should place this in Mobile today?
Um, there are a few that are rather vague as to exactly uh, the certain block that
Mhm.
they may have seen or a home may have stood. But what I found in most of the accounts is that Mobile, even in its later antebellum years, when it's really beginning to take on the shape of a true metropolis for the region, it's still a fairly compact city. So it's not as if you're going so far afield that you couldn't have a logical understanding of a region of town. Sometimes it's very specific. And the earlier in the antebellum period you get, which of course I define as after the War of 1812, when this area became part of the United States, up until 1860, right on the verge of the Civil War. The earlier in time you are, the easier it is to pinpoint because it's frankly, it started out in that early period still within the grid of streets that was laid out in the French and Spanish period. It's a place that once it started to grow, it grew dramatically, but for a while it stayed confined within a pretty set grid of streets. So earlier in time, it's a little bit easier. You go further in time, it may be a little bit more difficult to find, but you can certainly get some good clues as to because you know where the residential areas of town are, you know the riverside, you know the business district, and so you can get a good understanding of probably where people were when they describe some of the things that they saw.
Right, and just sort of for kind of reference here, like we're talking sort of like what like Beauregard brought street today as sort of the kind of edges of town, right?
Yeah, yeah. If you would go out to the Hank Aaron Loop going out downtown, you go to Government Street, and basically it's where that perimeter down to the waterfront just south of town at the container terminal,
Hmm.
north of town up to roughly where I-10 starts. It's these are just not hard boundaries, but that's the general area that we're talking about in its antebellum manifestation at its
Hmm.
fullest. You know, this is 1860, of course. Before that, it's going to be a much more compact area, but it's really the heart of downtown and what we call midtown today is what would have been the complete city limits at the time, right at the edge of the Civil War.
That's tiny. When you
Yeah,
think of
yeah,
modern day Mobile, like
yeah,
um,
yeah.
so before we, I want to talk briefly about the decision on the structures that you also took, but since we're on the sources, I really want to know which one was your favorite one? Which account did you love reading the most?
I personally enjoyed the account of Basil Hall and his wife
Mm.
because they had any particularly um, lucid understanding of things or description, but because of what they wrote about, and it was the frankness of the weariness of travel,
Mm.
and what it was like to be in one of these hotel rooms where you didn't know if you were going to have adequate blankets or somebody else was going to be sharing the room. And then they lucked up into having through a connect series of connections having a guy who offered Basil an opportunity to stay in a little house that he had that was unoccupied, and it was just, I mean, it was not a common thing. It was the most incredible coincidence, and he said something on the order of, you know, when I was offered this. I wanted so bad to make some polite decline. He said I could not get the words out of my mouth. I had to accept it. So this was a true luxury considering the travel of the day. And so it was sort of a personal account of really what it was like behind the scenes to endure the travel that these
Mm.
folks did and the accommodations that they had.
And that's a perfect segue to the approach that you took with the book, which um, I guess some readers might not enjoy, but I really enjoyed it because you took people from the outside to Mobile and sort of through the steps of getting into the city live. So was that sort of something you decided early on in the writing process that that's how you wanted to do it, or was that something that sort of emerged as you read the material and took notes and were like, "Ooh, there's something on entertainment, or there's something on travel, there's something on like how did it come about?"
It emerged early on in the process in the project. I realized that I had a variety of accounts that probably could be separated into certain topics, such
Mm.
as you know hotels and businesses, and that is experience and the travel experience getting around the city. I didn't know how all that would eventually play out, but as I collected everything and put it into a whole, I rather than trying to force fit it into topics, what I did was just say, I'm just going to group all this stuff together into what seems to be the main theme. And what I was pleasantly surprised to see is that once I separated it all out, they weren't perfectly equal, but I had a pretty good grouping of things that had a similar cluster of amounts of material that would allow me to kind of divide it into some chapters that just let the visitors speak rather than me trying to fit it into anything. That doesn't always happen, as you know, as an author, but it happened in that one. And so it just so happens that one of the things that was most commented about was the just the pure act of getting to Mobile. And I had originally not thought of describing travel from New Orleans and Montgomery or wherever else these guys are doing, and that leg of the journey as a separate topic, but it emerged, and so it becomes my chapter one. It's just that is something that they associated with the city is
Mhm.
just the experience of actually getting there from the nearest community. And I began to think of it. That's part of their memory and description of Mobile. So it merits a chapter. It's not they're not describing their entire journey in the South, but that final leg of the journey becomes entity unto itself. And so thankfully, it just kind of emerged organically from the material I had, and I was very, very fortunate in that it just kind of it created itself. And
Did you find it surprising of how they came to Mobile, or was that like, duh, of course they would come by water?
yeah, yeah, it wasn't really surprising to
Mm,
learn of how they got there. What was surprising was the amount of words that they
mm,
devoted to describing that journey. And
mm,
it's the human side of travel. It's almost as if you're writing a if you were asked to produce a travel narrative of a journey, from the United States over to Europe. uh, the experience of getting on the plane and going through the security and all of that, and then you get there and you're in a different time zone, and you got to just that is a part of it.
mhm.
That's the human part of the story before you even get into the place you're exploring. And I found that to be basically what that story communicated. It was the human side of just getting there wasn't always easy. It's
Mhm.
not just a, hey, I'm gonna go to Mobile. And I thought that was kind of added something that I didn't expect when I started the project.
I definitely can sympathize. Like
Yeah.
I definitely, if you wanted the story of how I got to Europe and my first week at work, that journey would be a longer story than the first week at
Yeah.
work. Of course, they're like
Yeah. Of course.
the details you remember of like, oh, my flight got delayed. I almost didn't make my connection. Oh, I had to lug my bags down an escalator in Salzburg and up again and barely missed almost missed my train. Like, like all those little details that you don't think about necessarily as interesting for others, but you find them interesting and you write about some. Like, yeah. And like the section we rode, like there were very few people that actually came by land, by stagecoach. And I could so sympathize with that because I remember this, forget who it was, but one guy that I wrote about with regard to my Macon book, and he in great detail describes the stagecoach ride in the middle of the night from Milledgeville down to Macon and how arduous a journey it was. And like,
Oh, true.
yeah, right. It's like exactly what you have in your book too, of like you do not want to go on a stagecoach in the 1830s in the South.
Beat you to death, and it's a slow road to get there, and the frequent mechanical malfunctions and breakdowns. Steamboat was by far preferable, but as you saw in the book,
Well,
did not mean it was glorious by any stretch at all.
nor safe, right? Like there were definitely
That's
safety
right.
hazards
Right.
as well. Um, and that the part that I didn't expect, probably in my own ignorance, was how much you also spend time on like the anchorages, like how that like you coming in by boat from the Atlantic or from the Gulf of Mexico. I'll put it in here. I'll be that guy. Let's go out of Europe. Um, and then you have to get on a small boat from your big boat to get to the city. Right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
like since we brought the airport thing up, right? You land in Frankfurt off your transatlantic flight. You're just wanting to get off, and what happens? You have to go down the stairs and onto a bus to take you to the airport terminal, right? Like it felt like
yeah, yeah.
that.
There was a multi-leg journey that really I'll admit when I first moved to Mobile, I was familiar with Mobile history, but certainly not to the degree I am now. But I knew enough to know about it being a major port and all that part of its history. What I did not even realize until I really got into research was that although Mobile was a cotton port and everybody knows that, and but people still today will find it surprising that Mobile Bay is a very shallow body of
Mhm.
water with some serious bars that prevent navigation by ocean going vessels that draw more than 8 feet of water in a lot of its reaches, and it's only because of modern navigation or dredging that allows these ocean going ships to come in and out of the port. And at that time, that was not being done on that level, so all this international trade that was happening in Mobile, and it's a large volume. This is a major United States port at the time. This is no, this is definitely in the top five ports. Uh, Most of that is happening by these vessels they call lighters, which roamed from the port
Mhm.
out into the bay. Could be a distance of many miles, so it could be 10 or 15 miles. So it's a really involved process to do all that shipping, and you start realizing the labor and the time and all that it opens your eyes to this is another level of enterprise, and it's something that people talked a whole lot about when they were in Mobile. So I think those are the types of details that
Mhm.
illuminated to me um, what was really like to engage in the type of trade that and the volume of trade that Mobile was engaged in.
No, like just looking at the map, right? I mean, we're talking about like Mobile, and most of the major ocean-going vessels are down near Fort Morgan. That's where the big anchorage was. So it's
Yeah,
you're
exactly. What they call the middle ground out there. That's where they would anchor, and then all the trade was ferried up and down. So you've got an entire another level of service and transport that had to be
Mhm.
completed to get back and forth to the port.
Yeah. Um, so let's talk first impressions. So I'm gonna go to Mobile in the 1850. What's the first impression I'm gonna see?
First impression, because most people are going to arrive uh, via the water. They're going to come up to the riverside port, the Mobile River. The first impression is that this is a trading community that specializes in one thing, and that is cotton. You could not escape cotton warehouses lining the river. Steamboats all were sitting there having cotton either put into warehouse or offloaded into lighters and taken to ocean going ships where they would load them up. Um, you've got a variety of all the companies that are involved in shipping and ensuring these cargoes of cotton are there. All the factors, the commission merchants. It's a busy scene everywhere around you, unless you visited in the middle of the summer. That was the slowest part of the year where there's not much trading going on. The rest of the year, you're going to see evidence of cotton lint all in the air. You're going to see lint hanging from the trees. You're going to see it after it rains, washed into gutters. And so you step out in the midst of this. And so the first impression is this is a place of trade
Mm,
above and beyond anything else. So that's your first impression, and then the built environment is going to have a few things that'll catch your eye. There's some pretty substantial antebellum structures that are still landmarks in the city today that are the height of refinement for Greek Revival architecture.
mhm.
But you also see a place that had mostly dirt streets in a a subtropical climate that gets a lot of rain.
Mhm.
Getting around the city is a little bit more difficult than you may have anticipated, and a lot of the domestic architecture is anything but refined as those antebellum mansions were, and so you end up with this hodgepodge
Mhm.
of a city that very much, even in the 1850s, appears a place that is in development, less than
Mhm.
one that is established and refined. So it's Mobile is becoming what it will eventually be in this period, rather than something that is this highly polished, refined,
Mhm.
sophisticated place. There are pockets of that, but this is a time period in which Mobile is growing dramatically,
Mhm.
and that growth is uneven, and it comes with a lot of hiccups.
Yeah, and it's sort of like when you think of urban planning, right? It's like, oh, we're expanding this season a little bit and build a new house, or we expand next season and build a house. And every time it's different. It's a new style, a new approach. Oh, I have no money this year. I'm going to build something cheap. It's this somewhat the organic expansion, but it's not
Yes.
the kind of like planned expansion.
Yeah, it's definitely not the level of planned expansion that you would think of, maybe if you're familiar with modern cities that are growing. And the other thing is that this is a city that was transitioning in these decades from a primarily was always going to remain primarily wooden architecture, but you're
Mhm.
going to transition in the core of downtown to having brick facades for
Mhm.
fireproofing. And several fires raged through Mobile at this time, and we read that today, and we understand wooden buildings. There's a fire, you can understand that may have happened. You don't realize that these fires closely packed structures before you got piped water. We're talking about entire blocks of the city would just be gone,
Mhm.
and you immediately start rebuilding it back. So it's resilient, but also they were beginning to understand that as this place grows, we're going to have to use some different materials. And so you end up with this true hodgepodge of different styles, different techniques, and you're seeing an entire 3 or 4 block swath that may have been wiped out by the fire. And right next to it are these beautiful standing structures that are highly decorated, and so you're seeing
Mhm.
this growth in real time. You're seeing the city evolve, and you're losing this one architectural uh, uh, description and transitioning to another almost season by season. So it would have been the ultimate impression. Going back to the original question, would have been one of a city that's dynamic and growing, but not doing so in an orderly, planned
Mhm.
fashion. I'll say that.
Yeah. No, while you were talking, I was thinking about the Palisade fire in Los Angeles recently, right? Of like how it just burned through an entire neighborhood. And like in many ways how we forgot like how important fireproofing our homes is. Uh,
Yeah. It changed life. Just simply having
yeah.
piped water changed life, not just for domestic needs, for cooking and bathing and drinking, but the degree of fire suppression that enabled is just it was a game changer in a way that we don't today think of.
No, exactly. It's normal for us. And I was impressed because you have two pictures of I collect correctly of the Battle House Hotel, which is like a
Yeah,
5-story, like massive building from the looks of it.
yeah,
And
yeah.
like it's Mobile. It's not this huge place like Baltimore or New York or Washington where you would expect that like was a Willard or something. But it's in Mobile that you have this huge hotel.
Yeah, yeah. Mobile saw a lot of travelers in its trading season, and it could support and did support some hotels and structures, businesses for visitors that are out uh, of scale for a lot of cities its size at the time period, because it was the commercial outlet for a lot of most of Alabama, a little portion of Mississippi, even on to northern other neighboring states. That everybody who was going to do business, and business was then internationally, of course, done by boat exclusively. It became a place a lot of people had to come through, and so Mobile has always had a little bit of a different cast as a tourist city in some regards than its neighboring communities, especially in Alabama. So yeah, the fact that it could have hotels like the Battle House and others, it's not just had one or two, that it had several of these, and some were pretty big. Just speaks to what it was at the time.
Hmm. No, and you mentioned already that it is a it's a seasonal town, which is kind of
Yeah.
a bit of a like, huh? How do you have a seasonal seaport of major proportions? Um, so how seasonal are we talking about? What lengths of time are you usually in Mobile?
The folks who had the ability and the wherewithal to leave when it got hot and hurricane season is really getting underway, left, and there would be a good portion of the city of the population that would basically be gone by May,
Hmm.
and not return until October. And
Hmm.
so the warm months, the hot months, that's when the cotton crop is all collected in the winter and to early and the late fall. Summer is the time that regional planters are growing things, but it's not when the business is booming at the port. So all that business just slows down.
Hmm.
Um, and a lot of hotels would even close up, restaurants would close up, and you would have the permanent population, which was a uh, small compared to what it was when you get this influx of people doing business, and it's just a different place entirely. And it was sort of the city would spring back to life again in the fall. That's when the theaters would open and the restaurants and the hotels, and you're in full business for a period of 7 or 8 months, and then you've got that cyclical reality, just sort of like you do today on a beach town,
Hmm.
on the Gulf, even Gulf Shores. In the winter, will slow down, and it's not the same as it is the rest of the year when people are coming to the beach. So it was the same thing in Mobile.
Yeah, no, I'm living in seasonal areas. There's a lot of our beach communities that are in this now starting up, and we have the shops open again on Sundays.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
like by October, November, it's all dead. And like we had family over in January, and like you couldn't even find a restaurant.
Yeah,
It just, yeah, like it exactly like seasonal environment still have that, unfortunately, for those who visit outside the season.
yeah.
Um, but obviously, where Mobile in particular, like you mentioned hurricanes, but I was also thinking here, like I mean, you're surrounded by marshland, and I mean, I can't imagine like what the mosquito population would have looked like at this point in time.
Unreal, unreal. They did a lot to try to control it. They figured out that standing water breeds mosquitoes, so they knew that
Hmm.
much. And they took measures to make sure that people were aware that they need to make sure to get rid of any standing water on your properties, because that caused problems. They also went to the length of, for a lot of antebellum years, they would actually keep barrels of turpentine and other things burning in the street. The smoke would lessen some of the mosquitoes or drive them away, but it makes you think that this must have been a really weird place to walk off to if you're from the Northeast and you step out and you got all this cotton, you got all this business, and then you got burning barrels and tar and soot everywhere. It does not seem like it would have been the most make the best impression at first, but they did what they could, and a lot of the visitors who came that saw all this and the difficulties that they went through to survive in this sort of climate, when yellow fever spread by mosquitoes would rage periodically, and they did not quite understand how to prevent all that. They just marveled. They said a lot of them. I'm sure you remember seeing in the book that there's like it must be a lot of money they make to enable people to even want to try to survive in this environment. So they came away with the impression that they're hardy people, but they had to be motivated by some other means because otherwise they just thought it was a death trap for people who work from the area.
No, and like when you were talking, I was like, wait a minute. burning turpentine and cotton fluff flying
It
all
doesn't
over the
sound
place.
good.
That sounds very combustible.
Yeah,
No
yeah.
wonder they had so many
Uh,
fires.
yeah, yeah. Some of them may have did. I don't know how all of them started. Most of them seem to start with things like cooking that got
Yeah.
out of something got too hot. But it was it would have been a unique place that to people from the outside who were not familiar with that sort of environment must have thought was incredibly foreign, just incredibly exotic, I would think.
Mhm. No, exactly right. And that's somewhat probably the appeal for some of these foreign visitors to come to a place that is so different.
Yeah. Mhm.
Um, it's-
Yeah, that was part of the appeal. They had heard a lot about it, and
mhm,
when they were on their travels, very very few were coming specifically for one place, Mobile. They were usually on a route. They would see New Orleans. They would do a sort of an American grand tour, which would take them down the Ohio into
mhm,
Mississippi, New Orleans, back up to the East Coast. That was a common route for a lot of them, but it surprises Mobilians today just how familiar the name of their city was for people from Europe,
mhm,
because this was one of the primary ports doing business with France and England, and people if they didn't know a lot about it, that was a familiar name. And so a lot of people, when they arrived, said, "Yeah, I've heard about this place. I
mhm.
was curious to see how it got on." And so it was a level of awareness of the city that is probably not been equaled since, because the city, I just don't think in relative terms has had the same influence and recognition than it did in this era, which goes back to one of the reasons I want to write the book.
Yeah, no, it's like trying to think of like when I, I showed students like a while ago like a catalog of European like what is offered from Europe to travel in the United States, and like the River Road is oftentimes in there, the Mississippi, but Mobile is not. I don't remember it standing out. It might be more these days because of Airbus being in Mobile, but like
Yeah, still, it's not going to be a
it,
very prominent
no,
player.
no, it's not like in comparison to where you what you have, right? New Orleans next
Yeah,
door, and then Florida on the other side. It's like that's where people go.
exactly.
But yeah. Hmm. So let's see here. Where do you want to go next? So we already had a lot of a lot of material here with regard to the cotton trade, and it was cotton the only thing that Mobile had going for it, or was there anything else that Alabama shipped out? Like, but then also vice versa of like when I did trade statistics for an article one time, and a lot of trade goes into the northern states, and then they kind of go empty to the southern states, put on cotton, and go out. Is there any inflow of commodities that Mobile gets that people are seeking?
Yes. Yes. First questions: what other things was Alabama exporting through Mobile?
Hmm.
Lumber was a
Mm.
prominent secondary export, and to a limited degree, um, some produce and grains, corn,
Mm.
things like that. But there's a small portion of what the
Mm.
export volume is in terms of dollars. There are years in which the export trade at Mobile would be as much as 95 or more percent cotton. Now, that doesn't mean it's 95% of the total tonnage, but it's 95% of the value. It was a market dominated by cotton production for export. Now, for import, those a lot of those ships are some are coming and doing this trade and arriving empty, and that's what they're going to go back to Europe with. But some were bringing in, a good many were bringing in things like furniture,
Mm.
their clothing, housewares, tools, things that are manufactured either in the Northeast or in Europe that they are importing, and the people who are doing that trade are then that is how that trade works. There's even a traveler who was in Mobile. That's just a funny little incident that's in the book, that the guy just assumed it's a major trading port. got all this money, all these people involved, and he was stunned. He said, I can't even buy a hat here that's made here. There's nowhere I can find anything made in Alabama. He said everything is imported
Right.
from England and France and it's on the shelf,
Mm,
even the books. So yeah, that was the nature of the trade, sending out that cotton that's coming from
mm,
these three river systems, draining into Mobile, and then importing everything else that they need.
mm,
And that's a lot of stuff. And for people who have money, which are certainly not the people who represent the entirety of the population, but they are inordinately represented in the cargoes of these boats because they are bringing all that furniture that ends up you know being a part of the interior decors of these antebellum mansions. Alabama's
mm,
so famous for all that stuff,
yeah,
the silverware, all these things. A lot of that is coming in on boats like
mm.
this because there's a big market for it because this is where these planters live and they are up and down these river systems and it's coming in through Mobile.
Yeah. So it's a perfect transshipping hub of like stuff
Yes.
coming in,
Yeah.
stuff going out, and then the riverboats carry it back onward. Um, but it did remind me as you were talking too of like the sort of, I guess, unpredictability of the travel in the region because you had a number of episodes where it's like, I don't know when my ship's gonna leave, or oh, my ship is leaving in an hour. I need to get on board.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. You,
the
posted schedules were very loose in the era of steam travel. As in any era, you got travel delays today, despite how regulated we have everything. So you can imagine an accident with a steamboat boiler or something that wouldn't fire up or a repair that needs to be made. There's not a real good way of letting people know that who are waiting for it the next day that we're going to be delayed by a day or two. And so a lot of people would sit there and they're just waiting and they have no idea where is the boat? Is it coming? Did it sink? And so there's a level of unpredictability and frustration that I don't think the modern traveler can quite comprehend. We get frustrated if our flights are delayed for a little bit. You can imagine if you didn't know if the flight was getting there at all. So this is what these guys are dealing with.
sounds like an Amtrak or a Greyhound experience.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Um, but the other part too that I kind of think we should talk about with regard to sort of like what's city life like is that this is a very transient population you have. They're just
Yeah.
coming there for a couple of months, 6, 7 months, a year, and then they're gone. So they're not owning properties, they're just renting rooms for short amounts of time.
Yeah. Yeah. You've got a lot of transient guests, and you also have that leads into the fact that you've got the most diverse population in the state of Alabama by every description. I mean, any way you want to take that phrase, um, Mobile is a place of business, and it drew people who there's really no other reason for some of them to come to Alabama at the time. They're coming to be involved in the trade, and so you end up with the largest population of foreign-born residents, the largest population of free blacks. Um, all these groups that are represented in Mobile that are not as prominent part of the state elsewhere. It's all because of that trade and the
Mm,
opportunities that allow for employment in that trade. And when you throw in that it's obviously a seaport, you're really getting a lot of
mhm,
transients that are coming in for short periods of times and going. So you've got an entirely different sort of economic structure
mhm.
in Mobile than you do in a lot of its peer cities in interior Alabama. It's always been a little bit different. And in this era specifically, it was very different than the rest of the state.
Oh, so there's Mobile and there's Alabama.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah, certainly, certainly true.
So that would also have meant that most people wouldn't have brought their families with them.
Yeah, the there was a a period of time in which you get this representation that's not really uh, in proportion to their numbers in the reality. But a lot of these planners that would descend on Mobile from way upriver, who were
Mm,
they would make an annual trip to Mobile because they're selling their cotton crop and
hmm
they're negotiating best rates and they're getting insurance, and
hmm
they would turn it into just a week of a
Mm,
little business, a little bit of fun. And they would bring families and they would stay in the
mm,
hotels and they would frequent restaurants.
yeah,
And so you get this perception if you were passing through that it would look as if a lot of people in Mobile had money and that you would think that there's this level of wealth, but the truth is
mm,
concentrated in very small number of people who are there specifically for a short time during the trading season. So there
mm,
is a little bit of a misrepresentation on some of that, but that's part of the economy is that the people who had the wherewithal and the money and the need to be there, it was an annual trip and they would stay sometimes say for weeks. And then you've got a group of people who would keep two homes and they would keep
mm,
one in Mobile and one out in the country or somewhere else. And so it's 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 not as much of a rooted, stable population that the visitors are seeing. And trying to understand that through their eyes gives a certain dimension to what the city looked and felt like that I don't think that the residents would have automatically recognized because they would be able to walk around and see who's here temporarily, who are the snowbirds who are coming south and all this. But if you're passing through, you may not know the backstory as much.
right. It's not like when you go to like Yuma or um, Southern California or Arizona, where it's like literally people have like their campers or mobile homes set up as their snowbirds. It's
Yeah.
not that
Mhm.
obvious.
No, no, definitely not.
Uh, Jeez, that would be funny. Your first trailer park.
Yeah, be interesting
Uh,
to see some travel writing on places like that. If these guys could understand that dynamic and write it from that perspective.
yeah, it's
But as
yeah.
it was, they did pick up on a lot
Mm,
of what was going on, and I thought that was an aspect that I just don't think that you would read a lot about from the local perspective. I don't
mm,
think that's the way they necessarily describe their city. And so
mm.
I thought it was really intriguing to have them kind of walk the streets with you and tell you
Yeah,
what they saw.
yeah, no, exactly. Um, since you're mentioning that they're coming here for sort of a vacation, quote unquote vacation with their families, what amusement, what kind of things can you do in Mobile?
Well, it depends on sort of how much you want to make public and versus private, because it's not a destination like we would call it a family friendly vacation. Rides around the city and boat rides and things that was very popular. Just sort of seeing the city, walking around, going to the shops, going to the bookstores, going to the restaurants. But where the real money was made, real entertainment districts, so to speak, with a lot of the sailors and a whole lot more of the gentry than probably wanted to admit it. Mobile had quite a concentration of taverns, brothels, gambling institutions. That again, I don't think many of the locals are really going to define their city by those institutions. But for people from the outside, this was a place where that was
Mhm.
found. And there's nowhere else in Alabama that has that proliferation. And part of a vacation down here and tending the business may involve a few evenings out and things like that. And so that was a part of the Mobile experience that um, these travelers were keen to note how that was different than a lot of other places in the South they had visited.
Well, yeah, and it's a port city, right? That like I mean, everything you say is like look at any port city in the world. That's what you're gonna
That's
get,
right.
right? Like when your sailor comes off the boat after 3 months on the ocean, they're seeking entertainment.
Yeah.
Um,
And they just got paid,
yeah.
and so they're looking to spend a little bit of that money. And Mobile had the facilities and the wherewithal to do that, which made it. If you imagine you're the traveler who's been coming down the old Federal Road or
Mhm.
something that's coming through the South, and you've gone through Macon, Georgia, and Columbus, Georgia, and Montgomery, Alabama. Mobile is a different place in every
Mhm.
possible way.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Like, I mean, if you're coming, like maybe Natchez would be similar in nature, right? With under the hill,
Yeah, on a
but
smaller scale. And the other thing that since we're talking about other amusements, so to speak, is people were very fond of going out where you could get some of the best views of the bay, scenic
hmm
bay views. There was a bay shell road, a scenic road that you could take out to enjoy the bay breeze. That was very, very popular. One of the things, and it formed a whole chapter for me, is just describing what there was to see, and it ended up that just the sheer proliferation of vegetation. This place is a subtropical. There's a lot that blooms here that may not bloom even in North Alabama at certain times of the year. And there were visitors who came in January and December and were shocked to see the greenery. And the place still has hard winters on occasion, but nothing at all like what a lot of these people were familiar with. And so just seeing the gardens, the magnolias, the live oaks, the Spanish moss, enjoying the sea breeze or the bay breeze on a warm afternoon in early December was a novel experience. And so it lent an air of exoticness to it. And so those are some of the entertainments that folks would do who were not necessarily going to the taverns and things like that. And there were some other things that came through, equivalent to traveling circuses or novelty shows. There were things that were coming to Mobile because it had that concentration of people that you wouldn't have found other places. They weren't a huge part of what was going on, but there were opportunities for that. But there was nothing that gathered people together more than the theater plays. That was the movie theaters of the day. And that is what people went to of all classes. And that's where you would have this one meeting of people of every possible diverse background and station in life and class would all be gathered. And it was that was the number one amusement for most people in town.
Yeah. And I'm not sure, it probably came out after you kind of finished the manuscript, but and unfortunately I was not able to do an interview with Thomas Boger, his book on theater on the American frontier, and he talks about like these different theater groups that move all about, and like out of New Orleans, sometimes did like a small stint in Mobile, and they try to establish like a permanent theater, and yeah, like what other entertainment there is there, right? Like,
Mhm.
and did you find anything of like what plays they were putting on? Because I was impressed when I read that book on the Frontier Theaters that it's like they were doing like 2 week stints and they were doing like 4 or 5 plays. Like, it was
Oh yeah,
incredible.
they would do a pretty good variety of things. There were several, and I didn't specifically look into this, but just anecdotally, I know that they were doing a lot of American plays that writers were coming out with, things that we don't aren't even familiar with today, but they would cast them just because they wanted something else to do. But a lot of it that was a core part of any theater of repute was doing a good bit of Shakespeare because a lot of these actors who would come and stay these stints,
Mm,
they that was how they made their bones as actors was in performing these, and so these were things that they were any actors were prepared for. So that you got a real combination of really the most highbrow recognized standards in Shakespeare, and then a lot of just recently written things that were short comedies, things that we don't even remember today, but they were doing everything, all ages, all ranges and extremes of what they thought would entertain people and bring in a few bucks.
mm. Right. Yeah, yeah. And it's like what else, like as I said earlier, right? What else is there? Because I don't think was there a court in Mobile?
So what?
Was there a court in Mobile? Like, because I remember sometimes in the antebellum times, people loved to go to the courts and see like court hearings and court judgments because it was sort of the
Well,
entertainment when you
yeah,
didn't have theater.
Yeah, that there was, but that was not something that the folks that I'm talking about
Mm,
would have been very familiar with. Would I mean
right.
some of the locals may have. Um, there was a very, but since you mentioned that, it struck my mind that for a brief period of time in Mobile, um, Madame Octavia Lavert, who became
Mm,
synonymous with the city. There's books about her for a little period of time. This lady who knew, uh, you know, um, Edgar Allan Poe and famous political figures and family had traveled around, had made contacts across the world. She became something of a celebrity herself, and she would have these weekly salons where she would invite
Oh yeah, I
anybody who was
remember that.
anybody. and she would welcome them in. They would have these all day, conversations slash parties and some enlightened philosophical discussion. And you almost felt that you hadn't made it in Mobile until you were invited to one of her salons sometimes. And some of the travelers who were of note received an invitation, and a lot just heard about her. But that would be for the most elite. They would have been invited to her salon in the 1840s, 1850s. It's not going on throughout the period, but that would have represented that you were really the pinnacle of society in Mobile. And there was for a brief time in this time period, there's a Choctaw camp
Mm.
of this is after removal. This is a small group of Choctaws who would escape removal. They would set up a little camp in the fall on the outskirts of town, and they would trade and invite people to see their camp for a small fee. And they almost are become part of the tourist economy because it's a way to make a living with these people in town. And you don't know exactly what sort of true depiction of Choctaw culture these people are coming away with, but they certainly saw legitimate live Choctaw people, and they would buy beads and they would buy necklaces and the things, the crafts that they're making for them. It reminds you very much in reading it of going to a Caribbean island and
Mm.
stepping off a cruise ship, and the natives are there to hand you allegedly authentic
Mm.
things, and it's probably inspired by something, but it's the opportunity to make a few bucks. And
Mm.
so that was going on, which was a very novel aspect of their entertainment mobile for a short window of time during the time period. So you've got everything up into and including Mardi Gras, which Mobile is very proud of being the home of the original Mardi Gras celebration. And it was going on. It had sort of recommenced in the 1800s, and a few visitors who were here while it was going on. And at that time, the biggest parades were held at New Year's.
Mm.
Um,
Oh.
they actually commented on that. There's some description of that. That's not something that everybody saw, and it was something that was beginning to take on the form we know today. It was certainly not as developed then. But anyway, that was for a small group of people got to witness a little bit of that. So you've got a huge range of things to amuse yourself with, but they're not always going on at the same time.
Well, you already took two questions that I had in mind for in there. Like, that Mardi Gras is really interesting, and wow, I did not. It's kind of sad when they didn't write more. When you kind of were like, "Oh, I would like to know more about this now."
Yeah, yeah. It almost some of these topics deserve their own history, and there it's certainly opportunities for future research. But I I put together all the ones that I could find and just let them speak on things that they decided to speak on. And just the fact that they touched on all of them is just sort of intriguing. But boy, there's a whole lot more that we could be said about some of these topics that they discussed.
But yeah, right. I mean, this sort of like Mardi Gras and Mobile could be another book, or like the
Oh yeah,
Choctaw post removal in Mobile could be just an article. I mean, there's so much that it opens the door for people who want to do Alabama, South Alabama history to kind of explore.
yeah, yeah. There's a whole lot more out there. The everything that could be written about Mobile is certainly not written. It is a city, like I said at the beginning. It's got a lot of literature written about the city, so it's very fortunate in that regard.
Mhm.
But it's got such a dynamic history that there's plenty of avenues for future exploration.
Yeah. Um, since you do have a meeting coming up here in about 20 minutes, I do want to briefly at least talk about something that I think is that I saw was very brilliant in many ways because of the audience that you're aiming for with your book. At least I assume you're aiming for with your book. And that was sort of like how can I find this antebellum mobile today in Mobile?
Yeah, yeah. I really wanted to have some component of the book help you explore on your own and discover what you could of what's left, because that's what interests me most as a
Mhm.
historian. I mean, everybody has certain things that drive them, and For me, historic sites drive me more than anything else. That's
Hmm.
just a personal interest, where things happen, where things stood, or where something still stands. And I felt the book was going to be incomplete if I didn't have something that addresses that. So at the end of it, I've got a relatively brief chapter, just a few pages, but enough to say if you want to see a little bit of the Mobile that these visitors saw and knew, here's a few spots to go to, a few particularly important structures or public spaces, uh, areas to view the river from, uh, to help you get some understanding of that real sense of what Mobile would have looked and felt like at the time, because so much of it's just completely vanished or changed. So I was glad I was able to put that in there. And I hope that the folks who actually visit the city and have read that will take a quick tour of some of those spots, because you don't realize how much it's all changed and gone until you're actually trying to write about it and you start looking around. And it's like there's really not that much. We've got individual homes scattered throughout the city, but they're surrounded by urban development, and you just don't get many places to have a vista of anything that would really put you in the mind of that time period.
Hmm.
So I did my best to try to locate a few spots that might help people do that.
So, kind of hypothetically and kind of speculatively speaking, why do you think that is? Is it that it just, oh, there's an old house, we're going to eradicate that in 1900 and build something new on it? That there was just a lack of kind of wanting to preserve that historic old structure, or was it just because it is such a bustling commercial town for all of its existence that it just, well, we need space for the port, we need space for new commercial activity, and this old structure has to make way.
Well, the United States especially has a really checkered past with preservation and understanding the need for it until almost it's too late. And you've got to also place yourself in the mindset of the people who were developing the town in the early 1900s, when it had a rebirth after a period after the Civil War. It went through a long period of stagnation where it began to revive with the development of the modern port in the early 1900s, and the influx of people and money that was brought into the city because of the world wars. And in their viewpoint, and you just try to understand things from their time, their perspective, a lot of this stuff was ubiquitous and looked old and dated compared to the
Mhm.
modern flourishing cities. And there really wasn't this sense that if we remove this, that the community is going to be irreparably damaged. They saw it as positive progress requires that, because in their mind, all those antebellum structures, they had superseded what had been there earlier, and they were bigger and better, and now it was time for something bigger and better yet still.
Mhm.
So a little bit of that was going on. Um, Mobile eventually did get a pretty strong preservation movement, which has manifested itself today to having a part of the city government is the Mobile Historic Development Commission, which
Mhm.
has some rules and regulations in place about controlled development in the downtown core and throughout the city, and recognizing historic districts and architectural do's and don'ts. So it has come full circle, but at the time, Mobile was sort of sloughing off this period of antiquated, infrastructure. And places like Birmingham had come on the scene. Birmingham wasn't a city in Mobile's heyday, and all of a sudden, after the Civil War, Mobile, from being the number one most populous city and center of trade, all of a sudden Birmingham's usurping all of that position and that money. By the 1920s, it's the largest city in Alabama, and Mobile is pursuing itself as falling behind with all of these relics of the past that you see every day and sometimes you take for granted. I think that was what was going on. And once you started losing it, is when you begin to have a real appreciation that, whoa, that's our character, and we need to preserve as much as possible. So thankfully it did catch up, but we lost a lot in the process.
So I'm going to give you a promotion. You're going to get the director job at the History Museum of Mobile. And your first job is going to be create some form of exhibit that gives a sense of Antebellum Mobile. how would you do it? Since you're a public historian, how would you do it? Would you like do like something virtual? Would you try to kind of do it through old pictures? Like try like get an artist to kind of draw like the silhouette of the old town? Like what
I think you would have to create something original that's a backdrop that shows the type of architecture that was there, the streets
mm,
that were primarily dirt. And I think that you would have to just be very candid and yeah, I think there's an auditory and even
mm,
a sense of smell that would communicate this because you would have
mm,
smelled something would have been burning.
mm,
Fires for heating and cooking for whatever would have been around all the time.
mm,
I mean, that's just part of the city. You know, in a way that we smell
right,
smoke now, and so something's wrong. Well, it would have been part of the city streetscape. There would have even been animals still roaming through the
mm,
streets. You would have had chickens, cows on occasion. So it would have you would have to kind of remove yourself from this polished urban core and say that in that period, even though it's a city, it still is a city that's sort of a frontier coming of age sort of city more than a East Coast city
mm,
that you may have in your mind's eye. And so I would approach it and say, what would it look like to look, hear, and smell what this place
mm,
would have looked like? And I think those would have been your impressions that you just lose unless you make a purposeful effort. You can't really just have a drawing to reproduce that. You've got to mix all
mm,
that together if you want to put yourself in the mindset of 1830s, 1840s Mobile.
mm. Yeah. No, it sort of reminds me of like I saw some ads when I lived in Austria of like there was like this VR tour where you could kind of see how the city would have looked like at this like when the Turks besieged it or when Napoleon came, and that must be
Oh
just
yeah.
sort of like something brilliant that we'll eventually be able to do with a lot of city tours, hopefully.
Yeah, yeah. Hopefully we can. Until then, we have to rely on our mind's eye
Yeah.
to appreciate it, and you just have to set aside what you think you know, and kind of be open to understanding how different it really was.
Right. Yeah. Um, Now since you work at a site that is related to the American Civil War, why did you end with sort of the American Civil War period?
Well, I've written this is the second book of visitor travelers accounts that I've actually written. I wrote one about Columbus, Georgia, which was my hometown, and in both of them, I've come to understand and I've written about the Civil War as well. But I really do think that once you get to the war years,
Mhm,
that's an experience unto itself. That's
mhm,
everything that you thought you knew is suddenly changed because you have a war that's going to determine the future trajectory of the city and the country, and people are dying, and the economy is radically uprooted, and people's attention turns to things that they never thought they would have to deal with, such as where we're going to put fortifications to defend the place. I mean,
mhm,
you've got the real threat of armies in your communities. That is a different topic. That's a story unto itself that I don't think lumping it to the antebellum era necessarily allows for a continuity of understanding because everything got turned upside down and changed so radically that the physical infrastructure is there. There's
mhm,
an attempt to carry on daily life, but
right,
when you're dealing with everything from shortages of coffee and to fabric to salt,
mhm,
um, it's a different place, and I think that those war years, in my opinion, deserve their own entity because that's an experience that was not the equal
mhm,
before or after, and so that's why I decided to end it with the war and truly make it an antebellum before the war
right.
a book and topic because everything had so radically changed by the time you get to secession.
Yeah, awesome. So I think we should stop here so you have a little bit time to get ready for your next meeting. But it was a great pleasure, Mike, to talk to you about Mobile today. Now I kind of want to come back and see it with that list of sites that you have in the back to kind of explore the city a little bit more again.
Well, thank you. Hope you'll be able to do that. And I look forward to reading your books. Now you got some stuff on Macon, Georgia.
Yeah.
Um,
I-
yeah. Yeah,
should still
and
be
that's a
available.
state I'm familiar with, so look forward to seeing them.
Yeah, great. It's well that way. There it is. Civil War Battles of
There you
Macon.
go. Civil War Macon. Yeah,
Sort of hiding behind my shoulders currently still.
yeah.
I need to. I always think about I should put it somewhere else, but forget. But yes, thank you so much for joining me today, and for my listeners here, this was a book um, by Mike Bunn, and it's The Southern Metropolis: Life in Antebellum Mobile, which is a look at Mobile from sort of different accounts of travelers coming through the city. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.